You know, for billions of people, the New Testament is this incredibly foundational book. But what if I told you that its oldest secrets aren't actually in the stories it tells, but in the ones it quotes? Okay, let's dive into this, because we are about to go on a historical detective hunt to find the very first Christian beliefs. So here's the central puzzle for historians, right? How in the world do we know what the very first Christians actually believed? Think about it. Jesus died around 30 AD, but our earliest Christian writings, Paul's letters, they don't even show up until the 50s AD. That's a 20-year gap, an entire generation of what looks like, well, silence. So what was going on in those absolutely crucial early years?
Well, it turns out the answer is kind of hidden in plain sight, embedded deep within the New Testament itself. You see, scholars have discovered these amazing things they call textual fossils. These are tiny, ancient fragments of oral tradition, things like creeds, hymns, little confessions, that are actually much older than the books they ended up in.
So how do we actually find them? This is where it gets fun. Let's open up our historical detectives toolkit. We're going to look at the specific clues that scholars use to spot these ancient bits of faith that people were saying and singing long before anyone ever wrote them down. So how do you spot one of these fossils in the wild? Well, this little checklist gives us the main clues. First, it often has this poetic, really structured feel to it. It just doesn't sound like regular storytelling. It might also use some unique words, vocabulary that the author, like Paul, doesn't use anywhere else. It also presents a complete self-contained idea. And here's the real giveaway. You can often just lift it right out of the text, and the sentence it was in still makes perfect sense without it. All right, time to put our tools to the test. Let's open our first case file. We're heading straight to the beginning of Paul's letter to the Romans, where he appears to be quoting a very, very early creed about the two natures of Jesus. Here it is. Paul says the gospel is concerning his son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God in power by his resurrection from the dead. I mean, just listen to that. Hear the rhythm, that balanced parallelism? It just feels different from the rest of Paul's writing, doesn't it? And what this does is so brilliant. It gives us this two-stage understanding of Jesus. On the one hand, according to the flesh, he's the human Messiah, a descendant of King David, planted firmly in Jewish history. But on the other hand, according to the Spirit of holiness, he is the divine Son of God, and that status was powerfully proven or vindicated by his resurrection. Okay, let's move on to our next case file, and you'll see how this idea builds. Now this one is a big one, the Christ hymn in Philippians chapter 2. Seriously, most scholars are convinced that Paul is quoting an early Christian hymn here, one he didn't write, but one that was probably being sung in churches. The hymn talks about one who, although he was in the form of God, emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name. I mean, wow, the language is just soaring, It tells a complete cosmic story in just a handful of lines. So the trajectory here is what's absolutely crucial. The hymn lays out this clearer four-step journey. It kicks off with pre-existence, Jesus existing in the form of God. Then comes the incarnation, where he emptied himself to become human. After that, his ultimate humiliation, death on a cross. And finally, his exaltation, where God raises him up so high that every knee should bow. It's a whole narrative arc right there. But here's the real kicker. That phrase, every knee should bow, is a direct quote from the Old Testament book of Isaiah. And in Isaiah, it's talking exclusively about Yahweh, about God himself. This early hymn takes praise that was reserved only for the one God of Israel and applies it directly to Jesus. This is an unbelievably high view of who Jesus is, and it's happening very, very early on. So, we've looked at the evidence, right? What do these incredible textual fossils actually reveal when we put them all together? What's the bigger picture they're painting for us about those very first Christian beliefs? Well, the picture they're painting is something theologians call a high Christology. And this isn't just a belief that Jesus was, a special prophet or a human Messiah. No, this is the belief that he was divine, that he shared in the very nature and essence of God. So, what's the final verdict from our little detective mission? Well, these creeds show us, pretty clearly, that the belief in Jesus' divinity was not some late invention that evolved over a century. They show that the resurrection was seen as the central, game-changing event. And they reveal that from the very beginning, Jesus was understood as both fully human and fully divine. These weren't some fringe ideas, they were foundational.
And listen, our two case files aren't even close to being alone. This pattern is everywhere once you know what to look for. There's a hymn in 1 Timothy that talks about him being manifested in the flesh, vindicated in the spirit. Hey, that sounds familiar, right? There's a baptismal formula in Romans 10 that links salvation to confessing Jesus is Lord and believing God raised him. And one of the most ancient little fragments we have in Luke 24 is this simple, powerful declaration: the Lord is risen indeed and has appeared to Simon. It's a consistent, widespread pattern of belief, right from the get-go.
Okay, so why does all of this historical detective work really matter in the end? What's the big picture here? What's the big takeaway from digging up these ancient little pieces of faith?
The key takeaway is this: these creedal statements, these little hymns and confessions, they are our earliest historical data for Christianity, period. They're like a time capsule, preserving for us the core beliefs from that crucial, so-called silent period between 30 and 50 AD. They give us a direct window into the ideas that were fueling the Christian movement in its absolute infancy, even before the Gospels were written. And that leaves us with one last, just fascinating question to chew on. If these incredibly complex and high beliefs about Jesus, as both the human Messiah and the divine Son of God, were already established and being sung in churches within just a few years of his death, what on earth does that tell us about the truly explosive origins of the Christian faith? So, did Jesus really rise from the dead? For a historian, that's not just a question of faith, right? It's all about the evidence. And the whole debate really boils down to this: was the story of the resurrection an actual historical report, or was it a legend that just kind of grew over time? Well, today, we're going to put one of the oldest pieces of evidence we have on trial. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll tackle the legend problem. Then we'll look at an ancient creed that might just be the answer. We'll see how that creed totally compresses the timeline and brings in eyewitnesses. But then we've got to get to the critics and the tough questions they ask. And finally, that'll bring us to the big dilemma every historian faces with this stuff. Ready? Let's get into it. All right, first up, the biggest hurdle for anyone trying to treat the resurrection as history, and that's this idea that the story didn't start out the way we know it. The theory is that it just evolved into a myth over a long, long time. Yeah, this is what's known as the legend theory. The basic idea is that those incredible stories you read in the Gospels, they weren't what people were saying right after Jesus died. Not even close. The theory goes that these stories were passed down by word of mouth for decades, and along the way, the facts got a little blurry and, people added some embellishments. Honestly, the best way to get your head around this is the game of telephone. You know the one, right? You whisper something to one person, they whisper it to the next, and so on, and by the time it gets to the last person in line, the message is just completely mangled. It's nothing like what you started with. Well, the legend theory basically says that is exactly what happened to the story of Jesus. Okay, but what if? What if we found a message from someone who was like second or third in line in that telephone game? This is where a really crucial piece of evidence comes into play. It's an ancient Christian creed, and it looks like it might just stop that whole game of telephone right in its tracks. So, in his first letter to the church in Corinth, the Apostle Paul quotes this really short, punchy statement. And the absolute key part is how he phrases it. He says, "For what I received, I passed on to you." See that? He's not saying, "Hey, I had this amazing vision and here's what I saw." No, he's making it crystal clear that he's just a messenger, a courier. He's delivering a tradition that was already there before him. And because of that wording, scholars, and I mean even scholars who are super skeptical about the resurrection, they pretty much all agree this is the gold standard for what the very first Christians believed. It's like this undisputed time capsule. They call it a pre-Pauline tradition, which is just a fancy way of saying it's a creed, a statement of faith that was being passed around and recited years and years before Paul even sat down to write this letter in the mid-50s. All right, so let's dig into why this is such a game changer. The fact that this creed exists completely crushes the timeline that a legend would need to grow. Just take a look at this timeline. Jesus is crucified around 30 CE. Now, many scholars, people like Gary Habermas, figure that Paul got his hands on this creed only about 5 to 7 years after that. But here's the kicker. The first gospel, the book of Mark, it wasn't written for another 35 years. So what does that mean? It means you have this fully formed creed. Death, burial, resurrection, appearances, the whole shebang, circulating decades before anyone even wrote the Gospels. That huge time gap that the legend theory needs, poof, it just collapsed. So the main argument from apologists is pretty simple.
this just doesn't leave enough time for that game of telephone to mess everything up. The story was basically set in stone, formalized way too early. There's just, as they say, insufficient time for some big legend to slowly grow and push out what the actual eyewitnesses remembered. But hold on, it gets even more interesting. This creed doesn't just mess with the timeline, it points to specific people. It actually names names.
And this completely changes the conversation. Suddenly, we're not talking about some anonymous myth that just sort of bubbled up out of a community over a few generations. Nope. We're talking about a very specific claim that's tied to a list of real people, people who were still alive at the time and who, theoretically, you could go talk to.
And here's the list, straight out of the text. The creed says the risen Jesus appeared first to Peter, the leader of the group, then to the inner circle, the 12, and then, and this is a huge claim, to a crowd of more than 500 people all at once. Then to James, who was Jesus' own brother, then to all the apostles. And finally, Paul says, and to me too. You see, this is not some vague rumor. It's a specific list of supposed witnesses. And this leads right into the next major argument. Scholars like Wolfhart Pannenberg say, look, because this belief is tied to the claims of these specific Jewish people right after Jesus died, the whole idea that they just borrowed it from pagan myths about dying and rising gods, well, it just doesn't make sense. Pannenberg calls it an idle venture. Why? The timeline is way too short, the whole context is Jewish, not pagan, and the claims are tied to real people.
Okay, so at this point you might be thinking, case closed, right? An early creed, eyewitnesses, it seems to totally shut down the legend theory. But not so fast. Historians and critics have some pretty powerful comebacks, and they're quick to point out that it's just not that simple.
And here's the first big question they throw out there. The whole argument we've been talking about kind of hangs on one big assumption, that legends need a lot of time, decades, to grow. But what if they don't? A critic named Robert Price brings up this fascinating historical example. A guy named Sabbatai Sevi from the 17th century. He claimed he was the Messiah, but then he was forced to convert to Islam. And what happened? Almost overnight, these wild legends started spreading about him. Oh, that wasn't really him who converted, or he secretly ascended to heaven. These stories completely crowded out the actual facts in just a matter of weeks. It's proof that legends don't always creep in slowly. Sometimes they just erupt.
And this gets to a really crucial distinction that critics make. They say, look, the creed is fantastic evidence for what the first Christians believed. Nobody disputes that. It proves they had this belief, and they had it early. But, and this is a big but, it doesn't prove the event itself happened. It's evidence of a belief, not evidence of a fact.
So what about that amazing eyewitness list? Well, critics have questions about that too. Robert Price, again, he points to that most incredible claim, the appearance to 500 people, and says, that's a little suspicious. And why is it suspicious? Because it's not mentioned anywhere else, not in a single one of the 4 Gospels. He thinks it was probably a later addition, something scholars call an interpolation, or maybe a scribe added it in later to make the case look stronger. So all of this lands us smack in the middle of a huge problem for any historian today who's trying to figure this all out. It's a real dilemma. I mean, just think about it. You have the exact same couple of verses from 1 Corinthians 15. One side looks at that text and says, this is it. This is rock-solid proof. It's the earliest, best evidence we have for the resurrection. But the other side looks at the exact same text and says, this is fascinating proof of a very early belief, but the belief itself is still just a belief. It's not verified history. It's the same data, leading to 2 totally different conclusions. And that leaves us with a really tough question, doesn't it? This ancient creed, it really forces us to think about the limits of what history can even do. It basically closes the time gap that legends need to grow, but it doesn't close that final gap between someone claiming something happened and the thing actually happening. It proves what they believed, for sure, but it can't, all by itself, prove why they believed it. And that makes you wonder, when you're looking at evidence that's ancient and a belief this powerful, how do you even begin to separate the belief from the history?
All right, let's get right into it. We're about to tackle one of the biggest questions in all of human history. But we're going to do it in a way you might not expect. We're pushing theology to the side for a minute to look at the hard, historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And we'll be using a method that pretty much everyone, from believers to the most hardcore skeptics, can agree on.
So here's the question that's going to drive this whole explainer. If we just look at this as a historical detective story, what are the actual clues? What are the facts on the ground that we can all agree on using the same tools historians use for, everything else? This isn't about proving faith, it's about understanding the evidence.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll talk about the historical method we're using. Then, we'll dive into 4 core facts that are widely accepted by scholars. And finally, we'll get into the really juicy part, how different historians look at the exact same facts and come to wildly different conclusions. Okay, so to get this right, we need a solid method. We're going with the minimal facts approach. Now, the whole idea here is to only use historical data that is so rock solid that it's accepted by a huge majority of scholars. And I'm talking about scholars from all sides, including those who are really, really skeptical of the New Testament.
Right. So here's the deal. We're not starting with a conclusion and trying to prove it. Nope. We're building a foundation of facts that pretty much everyone agrees on. This becomes our baseline. Any theory out there, whether it's totally natural or something else entirely, has to be able to explain this core set of facts. It basically sets the rules for the entire debate.
All right, let's get to our first core fact. And this one is the absolute bedrock of the entire investigation. It's the one thing that gets almost zero argument from historians today. And you have to see who said this. John Dominic Crossan isn't some conservative scholar. He's one of the most prominent and, most skeptical historians out there. So for him to say the crucifixion is a sure thing, that tells you everything. It's just not up for debate in modern history. It happened. And this confidence isn't just based on one thing. We have early Christian creeds that are way older than the Gospels themselves. But, and this is crucial, it's also talked about outside of Christian sources. The Roman historian Tacitus mentions it. The Jewish historian Josephus mentions it. We even have archaeological evidence, like the bones of a crucified man named Johanan, that shows us just how brutal and final this Roman practice was.
Now you might have heard this idea that, maybe Jesus didn't really die. Maybe he just passed out on the cross. It's called the swoon theory. And in modern scholarship, it's a total non-starter. Roman crucifixion was designed to kill you, period. Medically, survival just wasn't possible. Heck, even supercritical scholars back in the 1800s like David Strauss were already calling this theory impossible. So, fact 1, Jesus died. We've got that locked down. But this is where the puzzle gets really interesting, because the next 2 facts are all about what happened next, what the disciples claimed they saw, and how it turned their world completely upside down. I mean, just look at this contrast. One minute, the disciples are hiding, they're scared, their leader is dead, their movement is over. And then, a little while later, these same guys are out in the streets of the very city where Jesus was killed, boldly proclaiming he's alive, and they're willing to die for it. So, what on earth happened to cause a change like that?
And that brings us right to our second core fact. Now, the wording here is super important. Historians, even the skeptical ones, agree on this. The disciples had experiences that absolutely convinced them they were seeing Jesus alive again. Now, the debate is all about what those experiences were: hallucinations, visions, something else. But the fact that they genuinely believed it, that's a key piece of historical data. You know, the earliest account we have of these appearances isn't actually in the Gospels. It's in a little creed that the Apostle Paul quotes. And here's the kicker. Scholars date this creed to within just a handful of years of the crucifixion. I mean, that is incredibly early. We're talking about a direct pipeline to the original eyewitnesses, long before any legends could really develop.
So think about it this way. People might die for something they believe is true, even if they're wrong. But people don't generally suffer and die for something they know they just made up. The argument here is that their transformation from scared guys in a room to fearless martyrs is some of the best evidence that whatever happened, they were not lying. They were utterly sincere.
Okay, so we've covered Jesus' followers. But this next fact is maybe even more shocking, because it's not about one of Jesus' friends, it's about one of his most determined enemies.
Yeah, the story of Saul of Tarsus is just wild. This guy wasn't a sad disciple hoping for a miracle. He was actively hunting down the first Christians. He was their public enemy number 1. And then, boom, he has an experience that he also says was an appearance of the risen Jesus. The result? A complete 180. He becomes the Apostle Paul, the single most influential missionary of this new faith. I mean, this change was so sudden, so total, that it screams for an explanation. The critical scholar Reginald Fuller put it perfectly. He said that Paul's conversion is such a solid historical fact that even if we didn't have the stories about it, historians would basically have to invent some kind of massive transformative event just to make sense of his life. Okay, so let's recap our minimal facts. We have Jesus' death by crucifixion. We have his disciples being absolutely convinced he appeared to them. We have their radical transformation, and we have the shocking conversion of a persecutor, Paul. So, what do we do with all that? This is where the real debate begins.
Well, on one side, you have proponents like Gary Habermas. For him, that super early creed in 1 Corinthians is the smoking gun. He calls it the earliest and best authenticated passage we have because it's so close to the events themselves. It's a direct link to the eyewitnesses, and for him, that's pretty much case closed.
But hold on a second. Skeptical scholars like Robert M. Price wave a huge red flag here. He looks at that same creed and points to the part about an appearance to 500 people. And he asks a pretty good question. If that really happened, why in the world is it not mentioned in any of the 4 Gospels written later? It's a blockbuster detail. Price argues this suggests it might be an interpolation, basically a detail that was added into the text later on.
And Price does the same thing with Paul's conversion. That dramatic road to Damascus story with the blinding light, that's from the book of Acts, which was written much later. If you read Paul's own letters, he's actually pretty vague about the whole thing. Price suggests that maybe it wasn't a sudden miracle, but more of a profound shift inside of his already deep religious worldview.
And then another scholar, Bart Ehrman, throws an even bigger wrench in the works: the burial itself. He makes a really stark historical point. For the Romans, crucifixion was the ultimate public humiliation. The standard procedure for an executed enemy of the state was to leave the body on the cross as a warning for the birds and dogs. The whole idea of a proper burial in a tomb, which is kind of necessary for an empty tomb story, might go against everything we know about Roman practice.
So you're left with 2 very different ways of connecting the dots. On one hand, proponents see all this evidence, the death, the appearances, the transformations, and say it all points to one incredible, unique event. On the other hand, critics look at the same facts and see a series of separate things that can be explained naturally. A standard execution, followed by visions brought on by intense grief, and a story that grew and got more dramatic over the years.
And that right there is the heart of it. Do these facts point to an event unlike any other in history? Or are they a collection of psychological and social events that just happened to combine in a way that launched a world religion? History gives us the data, the death, the sincere beliefs, the transformations. It's up to you to weigh that evidence and decide which explanation makes the most sense.